So our presenters tonight, we have Dan Pettigrew, who is one of our attorneys who's actually presented on this topic, I want to say regionally, if not more than that, and Rob Conlon, who's here with GLSEN, and I'll let them introduce themselves more if that's appropriate, and I'll let them start, and they have a short presentation for you, and then some of the questions can be addressed to them, and then I'm happy to answer school district questions as well.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Obviously, the issue of transgender rights has certainly had a lot of publicity lately. I think both in terms of just popular culture, when you talk about individuals like Caitlyn Jenner or Laverne Cox, but also because of a lot of the legal cases and issues that have come up. And I think a lot of this has stemmed from the fact that there have been a number of guidance documents issued by the United States Department of Education and the Department of Justice in particular within the last 6 months. And there's been a lot of pushback and lawsuits brought. But I think, and that's all very, very interesting for an individual like myself as a school lawyer, and there are lots of cases going on. In fact, 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court announced that they're going to take up the issue of the right of a transgender student to access a bathroom, locker room that's consistent with their gender identity. So it's going to be front and center from a legal standpoint. But I think you have to step back and understand that that you're dealing with a population that is very vulnerable, and I'm sure Rob Conlon will go into that with in his presentation with some of the statistics, and they are very, very chilling. It is a very vulnerable population. It's also misunderstood in terms of the number. No one really has any great statistics on how many transgender individuals, let alone students, are out there, but each transgender individual or student have their own story to tell, and hopefully some of this presentation will give a little insight into how we as a school district are supposed to address their rights and being cognizant in how we provide a very safe and supportive environment for everybody, for them as well as all of our students. So just from a legal standpoint, what I can tell you is that as a school district, you are responsible, school board responsible for complying with not only federal laws but state laws. So the federal law that has attracted the most attention is what's known as Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972, which prohibits school districts from discriminating, or actually, because you receive federal financial assistance, it's any institution that receives federal financial assistance. It could be a college, and actually that's where Title IX sort of emanated, but it's also a school district. You cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. That's what the statute says. The statute is silent, doesn't mention gender, doesn't mention transgender. So that's the statute in the federal law, and that is what has been attracting the most attention, because a lot of the federal guidance that you have seen that's come out deals with, say, the federal government has taken the position that the statute applies to transgender, that you can have, for example, sex-segregated facilities that are comparable as long as you make them available to individual students consistent with their gender identity. And there have been lawsuits, as I had mentioned. Virginia, there's this big lawsuit in the state of North Carolina involving a state statute there and bathroom access, which I'm sure everyone has read about. There have been lawsuits in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and Illinois. Sometimes the lawsuits are brought by parents of the families of students who are transgender. Sometimes the lawsuits have been brought by the school district. Sometimes the lawsuits have been brought by parent groups. But for our purposes, and I need to really reiterate this, whatever happens federally, which you have to comply with, you still have to comply with New York state law. And New York state law very specifically says that, I'm referring to specifically the Dignity for All Students Act, and that says that no school district can discriminate or harass an individual on the basis of a number of different categories. Specifically, though, it includes you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender identity or gender expression. And so the state has spelled out that that is the law. So whatever happens in the nationwide, I mean, it's very, very interesting. And look, there's been a lot of back and forth, and you've read about it. But as far as New York State goes, New York State is very, very specific that there cannot be any discrimination on the basis of gender identity or expression. So when you're talking about students who come to a school district and they wish to, they're transgender, and they wish to be known. They may have been born biologically a female, but they want to be, they've now a transgender male. That's how they identify, and you know that because that's how they express themselves. Culturally, that's how they express themselves in the clothes they wear. And when they come to a school and they say, we want to be known as, we want our teachers to refer to us by our male name, then that is something that you as a school district have to respect. If they want access to, if they want to change their records, because they get report cards, IEPs, whatever, that's something that you as a school district have to respect. You can't discriminate on the basis of gender expression or identity. And that also extends to if they want to use restrooms, if they want to use locker rooms consistent with their gender identity, at least according to New York State law, that you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender expression or identity. So that's kind of a summation, a synopsis of sort of where, what the law is, and obviously I'll be happy to answer some questions a little bit later, but I did want to turn the presentation over to Rob, and he could dive a little bit more into the details, some of the statistics and some of the specific issues that this vulnerable population has had to deal with, and why it's very important for school districts to be responsive and to those concerns and needs. So, Rob?
So I'll try to make this one. Excellent. So, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So, I'm not a lawyer. All right, I'm an educational advocate, and I'm going to ask for activity in this, right? So, I'm Rob Conlon, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I am the co-chair of Bliss in Hudson Valley, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And we are the nation's largest organization working to create safe and respectful schools for all students regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity and expression, which is quite a mouthful. I want to give you a little bit of history about where we are in our transgender and gender nonconforming space here in the Hudson Valley. I've been volunteering for Bliss in Hudson Valley for about 15 years. When I first started volunteering with this organization, we could not pay school districts to have us come in and discuss this topic because we had the word gay in our name, right? For the last 10 years, I've spent training educators, parents, students, staff on lesbian, gay, and bisexual issues, right? Suddenly, somewhere in the mid-2000s, New York really figured out that we really do have lesbian, gay, bisexual students in our midst. In the last 2 years, our organization cannot keep up with the requests for training around transgender and gender nonconforming students. Our students are always ahead of us on this curve, and they are always ahead of us on determining what needs to happen in our school districts, and I want you to think about that as we talk a little bit about who they are. So I want to start a little bit with the genderbread person. Anyone ever seen a genderbread person before? Right? So I use this because it actually works for lots of people to understand the concepts of identity and expression. And it also helps us understand that identity around gender and identity around sexual orientation are actually different things, right? So if we know something about a student's gender identity, we know nothing about their sexual orientation. Those two concepts are completely different, and we have to understand them as such, right? So gender identity, gender expression. Identity is how we understand ourselves to be. Thank you. Our understanding of ourselves as male, female, both, neither, anywhere in between, right? Gender expression is how we express that to the world, how we express how we understand our being. Right? Biological sex is that stuff down here that the doctor says, well, this is what makes you a male or a female when you're born, right? We call that sex assigned at birth, right? That determination is made by a doctor basically on physical inspection. It has nothing to do with someone's actual gender identity or expression. Gender is a social construct, and we formulate our identity and our expression around that based on what the rest of the world is telling us, and that is different from time to time. And sexual orientation is who we are attracted to on a romantic and physical basis, and it doesn't necessarily align with any of these other things, right? So identity is here, right? Our orientation is here, our sex is here, and our expression is the way we tell all of you about that. Does that make sense? So what we see more and more among not only students here in the Hudson Valley, but across the nation, is that the terms male and female or transgender aren't even the terms that they're using any longer, right? We see more and more students that we work with identifying as gender fluid, gender queer, not 100% female, boy, trans boy, right? We are working with students here who are way further along than this presentation itself, right? That is why we still have some of the statistics that we have in our country around their experience. Most of GLSEN's research and most of the research right now out on the transgender community places the population at about 3% of the overall population. The LGBTQ population is about 10% of the overall population, which means to all of you that even within this discussion and even within talking about this particular topic, this section of the LGBTQ population is still smaller than the lesbian, gay, bisexual population in our culture, right? So if we take that statistic and we apply it to Hyde Park school districts, we're talking about from K through 12, approximately 100 students identify as gender nonconforming, gender queer, or transgender, right? It's a large group of folks, right? We don't see them all because our society still tells us it's not okay to express yourself the way you are. Gender identity is often known or understood in an individual before they even set foot within our school districts. Most researchers have identified that our understanding of who we are as male or female happens at somewhere around the age of 2 or 3, right? So as we think about this, we need to really think about how we create safe school environments from the moment that student enters our school district till the moment they leave and go out into our society as a productive person. Every 2 years, GLSEN runs national research studies that ask students to speak out to us about their experiences. And this is what we've heard from the students in 2013, and the arrows and equal signs tell us what they told us in 2011. So in 2013, 23% of transgender students or gender nonconforming students were prevented from using their preferred name in school. And that's down, which is awesome, right? 55% of students across the nation heard school staff make negative remarks about a student's gender expression. So that's school staff. This is not other students, right? 34% were required to use the bathroom or locker room corresponding to their legal or sex signed at birth, right? That, again, is a statistic that's down nationally. What we are excited about is that usually the New York State statistics mirror the national statistics almost entirely, right? So as advanced as we are, even though we have the Dignity for All Students Act, we look very much like the rest of the country in the way we treat our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students, right? Except for school staff, right? In 2013, the number of students who reported hearing negative remarks from school staff in New York State was 23%. So half of what the nation is experiencing. Now, I would like to think that has to do with the Dignity for All Students Act. I'd like to think with the fact that we have students who have come forward and said, this is not a respectful environment for me and it must change. I think it has a lot to do with all of those things and with meetings like this. Almost all transgender students report being bullied or harassed often or sometimes at school, across the board, in every state, in every school district, right? As compared to the lesbian, gay, bisexual population is now reporting 75%, right? So when I first started doing this work, the number of lesbian, gay, and bisexual students who were reporting bullying and harassment hovered around 87% of the population. So we've gone down with that. We have not gone down at all in terms of transgender students experiencing bullying and harassment. So this is why we're here today. Right? So some of the questions that we come across when we go out to schools and we go out to talk with people about how to make school environment better, and school environment better, it happens only when we combine the law with culture change in our hallways and in our classrooms, on our buses and in our cafeterias, right? So what should I do if I believe a student is transgender or gender nonconforming? Our first statement to schools usually is, you shouldn't just believe that students are out there that are transgender and gender nonconforming. You already have students in your midst that are transgender and gender nonconforming. So from the get-go, from day one of every single school year, you should be creating a supportive environment for all of your students, right? And that means respectful language for everyone. Consider displaying a safe space sticker. Many of our LGBTQ students are looking very carefully at the spaces and the words that we as adults are using, and the more we can represent a safe space for them in our environments, the more they will access us for help if they need it, or access us to help make the climate better. Consider trans-inclusive content in class where appropriate. Curriculum is the last hurdle for us in New York State in terms of really living up to the tenets of the Dignity for All Students Act, right? Curriculum is very hard around LGBTQ issues because it just doesn't exist. The history of this population, the history of this experience for most of these students is not in our history books. It's not in our graduate school classes. I can tell you, I have a master's in counseling and had exactly 2 paragraphs on the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender population in my counseling grad school. 2 paragraphs. Right? Do not permit students or other staff to make unchallenged, inappropriate comments. This, you all know this is intervening, right? We must intervene on this language, particularly around language that we hear other adults using. This is a difficult topic. We don't always have the right words for it, but we can't just stand by and not make changes when we have students who are at risk. And my favorite thing is replacing appropriate language with positive language. I say to every educator that I ever speak to about intervention, once you tell a student to stop calling someone a name and they stop calling them a name, they have met your request. The stop is the answering of the request. What we want to do is give them more language and more opportunities to have positive interactions with each other that don't require us to intervene most often, right? So stop calling your peer a name. And then the next request is, this is how we talk to each other in this classroom. What other words could we have used? Let's talk about why we're having this conflict, right? Oftentimes, students are left behind in knowing what to do because our request is stop. Right? A student has come to me as transgender or gender nonconforming. What do I do now? Right? First and foremost, you ask the student what that means to them and what they want you to do with that information. Many, many students will come out to us, will come out to a trusted person in the school district with information that they may not have ever shared with anyone else, right? It is critical that we have the conversation with that student about what they want from us and what they want us to do next. And it's also critical that we understand who and where and how and when they would ever share this information or what permission they give us to share it. If they give us no permission to share it, we cannot share it, right? So, and as appropriate, we work with administrators, guidance counselors, and other staff and students, family to provide support for transition and ongoing needs. Our biggest challenge with this particular population, particularly older students who are coming out as transgender, is that many of their families do not know. Okay? Many of the students come to us and say, I want to be identified by my male name and by male pronouns in school only, and I would prefer that you did not tell my parents. Right? That is a very challenging place to be for many, many reasons, because the first and foremost is we don't know what the safety risk for that student is at home and why they are making that request of us. And that is our very first task to do, is figure out what is the risk for this student outside of our walls. The next thing we need to do is figure out how we help that student make critical decisions about this information. As they request us to do things like change records and use restrooms and be identified in spaces with identities that don't match what their family knows, we must be clear to them that somehow or another, the outside world will find this out. We must help them understand that every decision they make and every way we try to create respect and safety for them has a consequence, and we must work together with them to make sure that they're making the appropriate decisions for themselves. How do I know if a student who self-identifies as really transgender or gender nonconforming? You just don't. There is no litmus test for identity. Any identity, whether it's gender, whether it's racial, whether it's religious. There is no litmus test. If a student comes to us and says, I am transgender, we believe them, right? What should I call a self-identified transgender or gender nonconforming student now? Whatever they ask you to call them, right? This is another area of a little bit of challenge that we have in some schools. Students who want to identify by a name that is clearly different than their given name, and educators feeling uncomfortable about doing that. But the truth is we use nicknames for students all the time, right? I often use the example that my birth name is Robert and I go by Rob. I have a driver's license that says Rob, right? So folks say, okay, that's a derivative of your given name, right? But I also went to school with people who were given a name like Tara and went by Muffy, right? Or Kim and went by Huggy, right? We called Muffy Muffy and we called Huggy Huggy without any concerns. If a student asks us to call them by a particular name, we should respect, and we must respect that request. Right? And pronouns. Pronouns are tough, folks. You're going to mess them up. When you mess them up, you apologize and correct yourself. How should I discuss transgender and gender nonconforming topics in class? Make an effort to raise your own awareness, use inclusive language, and research trans people related to your topic area. One of the number one things that we can do is to make sure we understand what our students' experience is in our school, right? So if we don't actually know what's happening in Hyde Park, if we don't actually know what's happening in Poughkeepsie for our schools, for our students, then we can't make the effective changes that we need to make their school climate better, right? We absolutely must raise our own awareness about their experiences and raise our own awareness about what it means to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender in this society. We use inclusive language, super, super simple, right? I say to folks, the simplest change you can make is changing your language. Instead of addressing a room by boys and girls, we address a room students, right? Instead of saying to a group of people that you want to follow you, come on, you guys, right? You say, come on, y'all. Right? We all giggle. But I use y'all now, right? It's the only regional colloquialism that is spreading across the country. Y'all, everyone, all of those sorts of things. Folks, right? Some people settle on folks. And research transgender people in our society. Right now, we are at a point where the transgender community is growing in visibility. It is also growing in visibility in a very particular segment. We have great visibility for transgender women in our society. There's very few visibility for transgender men, and I really encourage you to seek out and understand who those people are in our society and question ourselves as a society why we're not talking about transgender men. We're only talking about Caitlyn Jenner and Laverne Fox, right? So Dan already talked about some of this, right? We have a federal and a state requirement to allow students to access the bathrooms and the locker rooms of their that align with their consistently asserted gender. Right? This is often the place where we get challenged by what we're going to do, because as you look around this room, it's like very many other buildings, cinder block walls, bathrooms that were built in 1954 for men, for women. Right? So how do we make those adjustments? Some of the best practices we've seen in other school districts is engaging students in the Gay Straight Alliance to do a survey of the building and identify what bathrooms could be made into unisex or single-use bathrooms, right? Yeah. We're not talking about changing every bathroom. We're not talking about creating an environment where everything on earth is gender neutral. What we're talking about is creating options for all students, right? Those students who need to use a single-use restroom or feel most safe there, and those students who want to be able to access a men's room or a women's room, right? We're talking about looking critically at our environments and where we have left others out, where we can now include them. Okay. Locker rooms, some of the other things that we've seen in locker rooms are school districts who have put up sort of like cubicle walls to create areas that are safe and single use, or curtains and other areas in which we can create areas where students, all students, not just transgender students, any student who fears their safety or is discomforted should have access to a single-use space for their privacy. Talked a little bit about these best practices. One of the things that we have been advocating for with Glisson-Hudson Valley for over a decade is a district-wide policy on transgender students. Dan and I have talked even just today about the fact that many of our schools are doing fantastic work in working with an individual student in an individual building, and then that student transitions to a higher grade in another building, and no one even knew that they were about to enter the school and needed to have a gender-neutral space, right? A district-wide approach is absolutely critical, and everyone needs to be on board with how we work with individual students. School districts who have passed district-wide policies have done so in a very general way, right? We will work with every individualized student. We will create a support plan with students who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. We will do, as we talked about earlier, work with school staff, administrators, families to ensure their safety and respect in our school environment. Right? Remove gender-specific language from dress code and other classroom, school, and district policies. This looks like girls must wear skirts to graduation. Okay? This looks like, this actually came up the other day in a school district. Their dress code indicates that girls cannot wear spaghetti strap shirts to school. That means I can. Right? When we identify one gender as not being able to do something, we have just given that permission to the other gender to do it. Right? So that same school district also has girls cannot wear mini skirts that are any shorter than 6 inches. Right? Guess what I can do in that school district? I can wear a mini skirt that is shorter than 6 inches. Right? So we must look at our dress code and our gender-specific language, because we will be challenged on this, and we have been challenged on this, right? What we've seen in a lot of our school districts that's been really, really great is moving away from those concepts entirely, right? School districts who have had boys wear green to graduation and girls wear white, all those students now wear black to graduation, right? School districts who have moved away from concepts of a homecoming king and a homecoming queen, right? And moved to a homecoming court that is mixed gender, and there are no elections of any awesome popular students. right? So, use inclusive language that reflects the confusion some transgender, non-conforming students experience. I talked a little bit about this already. We need to take gender out of our discussion and put in neutral tones, neutral words whenever possible. Avoid segregating students by gender whenever possible. This is oftentimes on the elementary school level where the boys line up here and the girls line up here. Okay? I work in early childhood education, and it is still very, very prominent to set up our bookshelves as boys' books and girls' books. Lines, books, toys, and activities have no gender. Okay? We are the ones who create gender around them and often make many of our students feel uncomfortable. We've talked about single-use restrooms, physical education, and other activities. Really should be segregated by gender at all at this point, right? I had an educator say to me, but boys and girls play differently together. And my question is, why do boys and girls play differently together? Who is creating that difference, right? Sometimes it's often us as adults who are creating that difference. And address locker room requirements on an individual basis. So, we're obviously here in the Hudson Valley to help with any of this. Glisson National also has on their main website webinars on this topic and other topics, including working with schools who have families in rural areas and transportation needs and things of that nature. I just went through that very, very quickly. This is usually a 3-hour presentation, but I want to make sure that we have opportunity to have any questions for anyone that needs them.
Yeah, and the way I was thinking this could work is our presenters are here, they have a mic, and we have a wireless mic here. So that way we could have a back and forth with the presenters, and then that could work the best. And we just pass it to the next person.
What do you advise a parent to do if they want to change their child's name and gender in the record?
So New York State still requires a court order to change the legal name, but
I can amend that. Yes, so in New York, as Rob pointed out, there is a right in the records to do it by formal court order. There's a provision in the civil rights law that deals with that. However, New York also recognizes a common law right. So for purposes of school records, if the parent and the student could ask for actually an official change of the record without having to go for a court order.
right. So your rosters and your IDs and all of those things you can change tomorrow, right?
Right, but can the district demand some kind of legal documentation?
No, not for that request.
That's correct.
And we have honored those requests
Right.
without any documentation.
Hi, thanks for being here. So, if a student requests that they be known by another gender, and requests that their records and everything that around them, this happens without the parent's knowledge, how far back do the student's records get changed?
Okay. You want me to tackle that one?
Without the
Okay.
parent's knowledge?
Okay. All right. So there is a law, a federal law called FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which gives the parent the right, up until the student turns 18, to consent to the transfer of, consent to the sharing of any information, personally identifiable information, including a name. It becomes a little difficult. It's easy, obviously, if the parent and the student are aligned. If the student wants to do it themselves, the problem comes up is with the official records, report cards, progress reports, or anything that is available over, let's say, like a parent portal. So if the student, it's easy to do the pronouns, this is how I want to, class rosters, this is how I want to be known in class. And that's just a roster list, it's made available. But if you're talking about changing my official records for transcript purposes. Then it becomes a problem from the standpoint is that if a school were to do that without the parent knowing about it, and then the parent asks to see the records and they see a change, well, then you're going to have a difficult situation. But as Rob pointed out, you want to make sure that the student is safe. So I think it's probably important for the district to try to work with the student and say, look, I mean, there may come a time in your life when you're going to be able to change the records on your own. When you turn 18, you have the absolute right to do that because, as I mentioned earlier, FERPA provides the right to consent to amend records. That goes to the student once they turn 18 years of age. So perhaps from the practical advice is to counsel them, look, if you want to do that, try to work with your parents. If not, understand that this is something that we really can't do at this particular point in time, but this might be something going forward that you're going to be able to do once you reach a particular age. It is a very, very delicate topic because it's...
And Glisson would say, you don't wait until they're 18, right? So you counsel the student to say, we will honor your request, but understand that request, as you understand it at 14, that request does not remain in these walls, right? So that request will have ramifications for you. So we always recommend a decision-making model with every single student. This is the request you're making of us. This is the decision you're making. These are the things that will happen when we make that request valid. Are you ready for this? Yes. Are you ready for your parents to know when the report card comes out? No. Then we go back to the beginning, right? Then maybe perhaps you're not ready for this. Glisson would never say wait until you're 18 because we would never want anybody to deny who they are, right? So, but what we need to do is help our students understand that these decisions have ramifications in the system, which is our education system, right? And by working with them to make the appropriate decision at the appropriate time, we're also helping them be better citizens of the country, right? They're going to go into the workplace. They're going to go into hopefully community service and have the same sort of structural challenges, right? But if they learn how to negotiate some of these now in the school system with our help, then they're much stronger citizens as they go forward. We have to meet their request of that, but we don't have to do that in a vacuum without working with them. And in fact, we shouldn't. We shouldn't honor any of those requests without saying to the student, hey, tell me why we're doing this. That would be really awesome, right?
Thank you.
Any other question? Anybody on the board have a question?
Yeah, let's go back to the parents. What is then if a parent comes to you and tells you they do not give permission?
So this has happened. You have the responsibility in the education system to create a safe, respectful environment for that student.
And to violate the parent. Parents.
And if we look at research and we care about data, we know that in many, many of our communities, including here in the Hudson Valley, this is the only safe space for those students, right? So those students who are saying to us, this is difficult, and we see the difficulty coming from the parent end, we have a responsibility to create a safe space here for them. And if that safe space means we call them by their pronouns that they choose, that means we have an educational responsibility to keep them safe. 40% of our homeless youth are LGBTQ youth, right? Actually, the Hudson Valley and in this area has one of the highest homeless youth populations in the Hudson Valley, right? We have a responsibility here to work with that student and keep them safe, right? We can't just say to them, we can't honor this and send them home into a space that's difficult. We have the conversation with them. We work with them. We work with the parents, right? Much of the guidance around all of this really puts the onus on us as educators and us as adults to try and bridge this gap for our students, right? We have a way and an ability to say, this is really tough, caregiver, child, we will be the ones in between that help this work, make this work. And if this, and making it work means that we do a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here until we're all together, then that's what we do.
But you are saying we should violate the parents' wishes.
I'm saying.
Okay, Buffalo just passed their transgender, and that required a parent to give permission. Are they in violation of the law?
No, and they are not in violation of the law. I think Rob's point is simply you want to create a safe, supportive environment. I mean, most of the cases that you see out there that are brought on behalf of transgender students, it's the families, they're in support of the student, and it's because the school board may have adopted a policy saying you have to use a locker room or restroom consistent with your biological sex. Or we respect the fact that you're transgender, but you're going to have to use a unisex. So anytime you're actually saying you must, you shall, that's where the districts run into problems. But there are, as Rob pointed out, there are students who don't have the support of their families, and that's really something that I think that's a real challenge for school districts, but they need to try to work it through with the parents, because it's almost like denying that this student's identity until they become an adult. I don't think that's a very
But it is working
healthy
with the
kind of
parents.
environment.
We have to work with the parents, but
You do
if
have to.
parents say no, you're telling them we should tell that parent, you need to remove your school child from the district because we're not going to honor it?
Well, that went from no.
Well,
Hold on. That went from no to remove your student from the school district.
Well,
That's there's a big in between.
If the parent came to you and says, we do not want this to happen, and you continue to do it, the parent comes to you again. I'm just saying, where does that line draw between the parent who is responsible to 18? Where does that line go?
The line goes with the responsibility of the school district to be the in-between of that discussion.
Which means that you're going to violate it
No,
because that's what you want.
that's actually, what I said to you was that you work with the parents and you work with the students.
Until the parent says yes.
Until there is a safe and respectful environment for that student in the school. Right? And so what you aren't seeing on the flip side of that is that student has a right too. And if you say to that student, we will not do what you've asked of us to honor that, they now have a DASA complaint against you, the school board, or you, the school district. So the student's rights are also just as valid as the parental rights, right? So that's why our responsibility is to bring those two folks together, or those two groups of people together, so that we are ensuring that this actually goes forward correctly. The mistake we make is when we choose one group's rights over another, because then we now have each of those folks are not working with the school district. Each of those folks are going to be very against the school district. We have a real responsibility to be the mediators, if you might, between these two groups of people.
Yeah, but ultimately, we are not the parents.
You're not the parents.
So I'm just struggling to trying to figure out where this balance is. I mean, I like the idea of cubicles and curtain spaces in the locker rooms, because it's not just transgender.
No,
It goes people that are straight and people that are gay. They say, oh, we don't want this back and forth. It's whether you're skinny, you're overweight. It goes across the board when it comes to a locker room. I think that's a great idea. It'd be nice to see the district do something similar to that. So that's a great idea. But I'm struggling at the parents' role.
Well, and I think that the struggle that you're expressing is not new or not unheard of. It is also one sort of based in a black and white concept, right? And so what we always advocate for is that we include a discussion, an ongoing discussion with that student and the caregivers on how to create safety, both hopefully at home and in the school district. If there is conflict between those two things, we should never just stay at the conflict and make one decision. Right? So you may come to a point in a particular situation where you do have parents who never, ever, ever, ever will allow this to happen. Then you have a responsibility as a school to help that student feel okay. Right? And if you come down to the fact that you have, as a school district, and you have said, we will absolutely not honor your request, student, because your caregivers are against it, then now you have a responsibility to move forward with that student and the fact that you violated their Dignity for All Students Act rights. Right? So one way or the other, we're going to have to work down this path where someone works together in the gray world, right? And that's, I mean, that whole spectrum thing I talked about, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that this is not black and white. If it was black and white, we wouldn't be here today. Right? If it was so.
So then let's go back to the law of the Dignity Act. So where does that fall with the parent? And he says not, then we are in violation because where does that fall within the law?
Well, the Dignity for All Students Act prohibits any student or any staff member from violating a student's right or discriminating against a student on the basis of, for example, gender expression or identity. That's what the statute says.
So the parents really don't have any say?
It doesn't really address the parents. The statute does not really address the parents per se, no.
All right. Any other questions? I have a question, since I'm on the policy committee. Do you work with the New York State School Boards Association to generate a transgender policy? I find it a little troubling if 700 districts all come up with slightly different policies that conflict. Yeah. So I would feel better with an explanation of why transgender and not other, and need a separate policy, and also to have one that's consistently used throughout the state, so that when I read it and we discuss it, I know that it's been vetted, it's been the lawyers have looked at it, and other areas are and other school districts are using that. I would feel much better that than for us in our little group to come up with a transgender policy, because I'm not sure we could do a good job without all the facts.
So GLSEN has always worked with the statewide and the national organizations doing this. Unfortunately, as we've seen, guidance from the State Ed Department and the School Board Association isn't always as rapid as we need it to be for this topic.
Okay.
So can I tell you what's forthcoming? I don't know that, right? And to your question about why do we need this for transgender students and not other students, the reason we need it for these particular students is because many of the things we're talking about are also across the building lines and across facility concepts, right? Mm-hmm. So when I come out as a gay student, there is no real requirement for you to change the facility, right? But if I come out as a transgender student, I may actually request you to change the facility. So as a school district, having a plan for a request like that is critical.
I would think a policy would have more than just that in it. The facilities.
No, I was giving you an example.
Now you're adding, once you get, how far do you go, where do you, I don't want to be the one making or Denise here, we're the committee.
An example of why there's a separate discussion about these particular students.
Okay.
And it's also because, as we see, they are still the most vulnerable students in our school districts.
That's well-known. You don't have to do much reading to know that. No. Any other questions from the board? Or this has been really wonderful. At least I got a lot out of it. Thank you very, very much for being here. I'm going to get, I think it's well done. Because it's a topic people don't talk about.